On the morning of, millions of Americans watched their television screens with excitement. School children had gathered in classrooms across the country. Teachers rolled televisions into classrooms, eager to witness what was expected to be another proud chapter in American space exploration. Families, journalists, and NASA employees all waited for the launch of Space Shuttle Challenger. Nobody knew they were about to witness one of the most heartbreaking moments in the history of spaceflight. The Challenger disaster remains one of the most studied engineering failures in modern history. It wasn't simply a tragic accident. It was the result of technical problems, communication failures, management decisions, and organizational pressure that together created a perfect storm. More than 3 decades later, the lessons learned from that day continue to influence how space missions are planned and executed around the world. By the mid-S, NASA had become a symbol of American innovation. The Space Shuttle program was designed to make access to space routine. Unlike earlier spacecraft that could only fly once, the shuttles were reusable, allowing astronauts to conduct scientific research, deploy satellites, and perform experiments in orbit. Challenger itself had already completed 9 successful missions before its final flight. NASA wanted the public to see spaceflight as something becoming increasingly normal. The agency believed regular shuttle launches would inspire future generations, while proving that reusable spacecraft could revolutionize space travel. One of the biggest reasons the Challenger mission attracted worldwide attention was the presence of Christa McAuliffe. She wasn't a military pilot or career astronaut. She was a high school social studies teacher from New Hampshire, selected from more than applicants for NASA's Teacher in Space project. The idea behind the program was simple but powerful. By sending an ordinary teacher into orbit, NASA hoped to inspire millions of students to dream bigger and become interested in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. McAuliffe planned to teach lessons directly from space, making history as the first private citizen to fly aboard the Space Shuttle. Her selection turned the mission into a national event. Students eagerly anticipated watching their teacher perform experiments in orbit. Television networks provided extensive coverage, and public excitement reached levels rarely seen for a shuttle launch. The Challenger crew represented an extraordinary collection of talent and experience. Commander Francis Dick Scobie had previously flown aboard Challenger. Pilot Michael Smith was making his first journey into space. Mission specialists Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, Ronald McNair, and Gregory Jarvis each brought unique expertise in engineering and science. Together with Christa McAuliffe, they formed a crew united by curiosity, dedication, and courage. Behind the scenes, however, engineers were growing increasingly concerned about something far less inspiring: the weather. The night before launch, temperatures at Kennedy Space Center dropped to unusually low levels. Ice formed on parts of the launch pad. Engineers worried that the freezing conditions could affect components designed to seal the shuttle's solid rocket boosters. These boosters were essential. They generated the enormous thrust needed to lift Challenger from Earth. Each booster consisted of several sections connected together. At every joint, rubber seals known as O-rings prevented hot gases from escaping during launch. The O-rings had shown signs of erosion on previous missions. Although the issue had been documented, no catastrophic failure had occurred. Some engineers believed the problem demanded immediate attention before another launch. Among the most vocal was engineer Roger Boisjoli, who had repeatedly warned that launching in unusually cold temperatures could make the O-rings less flexible. If they failed to seal properly during ignition, extremely hot gases could escape and damage the shuttle. The evening before launch became one of the most important meetings in NASA history. Engineers from Morton Thiokol, the company responsible for the solid rocket boosters, participated in lengthy discussions with NASA officials. Several engineers strongly recommended delaying the launch until temperatures increased. Their concern wasn't theoretical. Rubber behaves differently in cold weather. Lower temperatures reduce flexibility, making it harder for the O-rings to seal immediately under pressure. Initially, company engineers recommended against launching, but as discussions continued, pressure mounted. NASA managers questioned whether there was sufficient evidence to justify another delay. Challenger had already experienced multiple schedule changes. Every postponement disrupted future missions, and attracted increasing public attention. Eventually, senior management at Morton Thiokol reversed the engineers' recommendation and approved the launch. Years later, this decision would become one of the most controversial management choices ever examined during an accident investigation. As dawn arrived on, the launch pad remained unusually cold. Ice inspectors documented frozen conditions around the vehicle. While some ice concerns were addressed, the shuttle ultimately received clearance for launch. Initially, everything appeared normal. Massive flames erupted beneath the shuttle as it climbed into a clear blue sky. Millions watched with excitement as the spacecraft accelerated toward orbit. Unknown to almost everyone watching, tiny puffs of dark smoke had already escaped from one of the solid rocket booster joints immediately after liftoff. Those brief puffs indicated that the primary O-ring seal had not functioned perfectly. Fortunately, for a few moments, combustion byproducts temporarily sealed the gap, but only temporarily. As Challenger continued climbing, changing aerodynamic forces placed increasing stress on the booster joints. About 1 minute into flight, the temporary seal failed. A jet of superheated gas escaped through the damaged joint. The flame struck the nearby external fuel tank, gradually weakening its structure. Inside that enormous orange tank were millions of pounds of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. The leak continued growing. After launch, structural failure occurred. The external tank broke apart. What investigators eventually discovered would permanently change NASA, engineering ethics, safety culture, and the future of human spaceflight. In the moments after Challenger broke apart, confusion spread across launch control, television studios, classrooms, and homes around the world. For several seconds, many people watching the live broadcast did not fully understand what they had seen. The shuttle had disappeared into a massive cloud of smoke and vapor, and the familiar image of a successful ascent had suddenly turned into something unrecognizable. Inside Mission Control, the atmosphere changed instantly. Flight controllers were trained to remain calm during emergencies, but the silence that followed was unlike anything most of them had ever experienced. Controllers searched their displays, called for communications checks, and tried to determine whether the crew might still be responding. Then came the realization that contact with Challenger had been lost. Across the United States, schoolchildren who had gathered to watch Krista McAuliffe become the first teacher in space were left stunned. Teachers struggled to explain what had happened. Television anchors, who had been narrating a routine launch, suddenly found themselves reporting a national tragedy in real time. The emotional impact was immediate and enormous. Challenger was not just another spacecraft. Because of the Teacher in Space project, millions of Americans felt personally connected to the mission. The astronauts were not distant figures hidden behind technical language. They were introduced as people with families, careers, and dreams. As search and recovery operations began in the Atlantic Ocean, attention quickly turned toward one urgent question: what caused the disaster? Within hours, NASA and government officials began organizing a formal investigation. The scale of the tragedy demanded more than an internal review. President Ronald Reagan announced the formation of an independent commission to examine the accident and determine exactly what had gone wrong. This group became known as the Rogers Commission. It was chaired by former Secretary of State William P. Rogers and included astronauts, engineers, military leaders, scientists, and public officials. Among the most influential members was Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman. At first, investigators focused on the physical evidence recovered from the ocean. Pieces of the shuttle, the external tank, and the solid rocket boosters were carefully collected and analyzed. Engineers reconstructed the sequence of events from telemetry data, photographs, video footage, and recovered debris. As the investigation progressed, one area quickly drew intense attention: the right solid rocket booster. The solid rocket boosters were built in segments connected by joints. At each joint, rubber seals called O-rings were designed to prevent hot gases from escaping during ignition and flight. Investigators discovered that the primary O-ring in the right booster joint had failed shortly after liftoff. Evidence showed that hot gases had escaped through the joint, creating a flame that burned through nearby structures. Eventually, that flame weakened the connection between the booster and the external fuel tank. Once the external tank failed, the shuttle was subjected to forces it could not survive. The technical cause was becoming clearer, but the investigation uncovered something even more troubling. The O-ring problem was not completely unknown before the launch. Engineers from Morton Thiokol had previously observed O-ring erosion on earlier shuttle flights. Although previous missions had not resulted in disaster, the erosion suggested that the seals were not always performing as intended. Roger Boisjoli and several other engineers had become increasingly concerned. They believed that launching in cold temperatures could make the O-rings less resilient and delay their ability to seal the joint during ignition. The night before launch, those concerns were formally raised during teleconferences between Morton Thiokol and NASA. Initially, the engineers recommended against launching Challenger. That recommendation was significant. Engineers were effectively saying that the risk was too high. However, during the discussions, NASA managers questioned the data and asked for stronger evidence that the launch would be unsafe. After internal discussions within Morton Thiokol, senior management reversed the engineers' recommendation and approved the launch. This moment became one of the most heavily examined decisions in the entire investigation. It was not simply a technical failure. It was also a failure of communication, judgment, and organizational culture point. One of the most memorable moments of the Rogers Commission hearings came from Richard Feynman. Feynman was known for his direct, practical approach to science. During a televised hearing, he performed a simple demonstration that helped the public understand the O-ring problem. He placed a small piece of O-ring material into a glass of ice water. After a short time, he removed it and showed that the rubber had become stiff and slow to return to its original shape. The demonstration was simple, but its impact was enormous. It visually illustrated what engineers had been worried about. Cold temperatures could reduce the flexibility of the O-rings, making them less effective during the critical moments after launch. Feynman later wrote that reality must take precedence over public relations, because nature cannot be fooled. That statement became one of the defining lessons of the Challenger investigation. As investigators continued their work, they realized that the disaster could not be explained by a single damaged seal alone. The Rogers Commission concluded that NASA's organizational culture had played a major role. Over time, shuttle launches had become more frequent. The program was increasingly presented as reliable and routine. Schedule pressure was significant, and delays affected future missions, budgets, public expectations, and political support. Because previous flights had experienced O-ring erosion without catastrophic failure, some managers began to view the problem as acceptable. This is sometimes described as the normalization of deviance, when repeated exposure to a problem without immediate disaster gradually makes that problem seem less dangerous than it really is. In other words, the absence of a previous catastrophe was incorrectly treated as evidence that the risk was manageable. The crew members were remembered not only for their professional achievements, but also for their personalities, families, and dedication to exploration. Francis Dick Scobie was remembered as a skilled commander and respected leader. Michael Smith was making his first journey into space. Judith Resnick was one of NASA's most accomplished engineers and astronauts. Ellison Onizuka became the first Asian American astronaut in space. Ronald McNair was a physicist and saxophonist whose achievements inspired many. Gregory Jarvis had worked on satellite and communications technology. Krista McAuliffe represented millions of teachers and students who believed space exploration belonged to everyone. Memorial services were held across the country. Schools, universities, and communities honored the crew. For many Americans, the Challenger disaster became one of those unforgettable moments when they remembered exactly where they were when they heard the news. One of the more difficult questions investigators examined involved the crew cabin. The shuttle did not explode in the way many people initially assumed. After the vehicle broke apart, the crew cabin separated and continued upward before eventually falling into the Atlantic Ocean. Investigators recovered the cabin during the search operation. Because of the sensitive nature of the findings, official reports treated many details with care and respect for the families. The investigation confirmed that the forces involved in the accident were catastrophic. The most important point for a documentary script is not to focus on graphic details, but to acknowledge that the crew faced an unimaginable situation during the final moments of the mission. The Challenger disaster forced NASA to make major changes. Shuttle flights were suspended for nearly 3 years. Engineers redesigned the solid rocket booster joints and improved the O-ring sealing system. Safety reviews became more rigorous, and communication between engineers and management received greater attention. NASA also reconsidered how the shuttle program was presented to the public. Spaceflight would no longer be described as routine. The return-to-flight mission, launched in September aboard Space Shuttle Discovery. The mission was successful, but the atmosphere was very different from earlier launches. The excitement remained, but it was accompanied by a deeper awareness of the risks involved. The Challenger disaster became a case study taught in engineering schools, management courses, safety programs, and aerospace organizations around the world. It demonstrated that disasters rarely result from a single mistake. Instead, they often emerge from a chain of technical issues, communication breakdowns, assumptions, and decisions made under pressure. The tragedy also reminded the world that exploration always involves risk. The astronauts aboard Challenger understood that risk. They trained for years, accepted the dangers of spaceflight, and believed in the importance of discovery. Their legacy is not only the memory of a terrible accident, it is also the lesson that safety concerns must be heard, evidence must be respected, and no schedule or public expectation should outweigh the realities of engineering. For millions of people who watched that launch the image of Challenger against the blue sky remains unforgettable. But the lasting impact of the disaster is not simply the shock of what happened. It is the knowledge that the tragedy changed how humanity approaches space exploration, making future missions safer because the lessons were learned at such a painful cost. Although the Rogers Commission completed its investigation and identified the technical and organizational causes of the Challenger disaster, the story did not end with the publication of its report. In many ways, the years that followed became just as important as the investigation itself. NASA faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding public confidence while proving that it had truly learned from one of the darkest moments in its history. The agency understood that simply redesigning a mechanical component would not be enough. Challenger had exposed weaknesses in communication, decision-making, and safety culture. To regain the trust of astronauts, engineers, and the public, NASA needed to change how it approached every mission. One of the first priorities was redesigning the solid rocket boosters. Engineers carefully examined every aspect of the field joints where the O-rings had failed. New sealing systems were introduced, additional safety features were added, and the joints were redesigned to reduce the chance of hot gases escaping during launch. These improvements were subjected to extensive testing under a wide range of temperatures and conditions before another shuttle was allowed to fly. NASA also strengthened its quality control procedures. Independent safety organizations gained a greater role in reviewing mission readiness. Engineers were encouraged to raise concerns without fear that their opinions would be ignored or dismissed. The goal was to ensure that technical evidence received the attention it deserved, regardless of schedule pressures. Another major lesson involved communication. During the Challenger investigation, officials realized that important engineering concerns had become diluted as they moved through different levels of management. Information that began as a serious warning was sometimes interpreted as a manageable issue by the time it reached senior decision-makers. To address this problem, NASA worked to create clearer reporting structures. Engineers were expected to communicate risks directly, and managers were encouraged to ask difficult questions rather than assume previous success guaranteed future safety. These changes reflected a simple but powerful idea. Successful missions should never create complacency. History had shown that repeated success could sometimes lead organizations to underestimate risks. Challenger became a lasting reminder that every mission deserves the same careful attention, regardless of how many launches have come before. Nearly 32 months after the accident, NASA was finally ready to return to space. On September 29, 1988, Space Shuttle Discovery lifted off on mission STS-26. Unlike previous launches, this one carried enormous emotional weight. Every system had been inspected repeatedly. Engineers monitored every stage of the countdown with extraordinary caution. Millions watched the launch,